Hello, everyone, and welcome to Howling Coyote. And I'm happy to have Andrea Reid with me tonight. She's the principal investigator and founder of the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, and she's a citizen of the Niska Nation. And I just want to mention that I'm recording from the unceded territory of the Penobscot Nation and to acknowledge its elders, past, present, and future. So, Andrea, I'm really excited to talk to you because mostly I talk to health people about two-eyed seeing, and I just think it's so refreshing to talk to someone who knows about fish. Fish, I guess the plural is fish. So, so can you give us an overview of sort of how you came into the whole notion of two-eyed seeing and the Center for Indigenous Fisheries and just all of that wonderful stuff?
Sure, my pleasure. So I'm joining today from Niska territory, so sitting on the British Columbia, Alaska so-called border. I'm in the village of New Ianch or Gitlek Damix, but I didn't grow up in Niska territory. I was raised far outside of this place, on the opposite side of Canada, and was raised in Mi'kma'ki. And so it was in part kind of that connection to that community that I came to know about Eweptimuk of two-eyed seeing, and had the opportunity to get to know of and then get to know personally Mi'kmaq elder Dr. Albert Marshall, who is a carrier of this teaching alongside his late wife Merdina. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about the application of Eweptimuk in fish, in fisheries research and management, because for so long this has been a discipline really dominated by kind of a westernized approach to taking care of our waters and their inhabitants through approaches that are really command and control. And I think this is really an invitation to think about our relationships with fish and fisheries in a different way. And so it's really in that learning from and with Albert that I've gotten to get to apply this concept, this teaching to my work, and is a strong motivator for the creation of the Center for Indigenous Fisheries that is really predicated on holding up multiple ways of knowing as we come to work with Indigenous partners across British Columbia, as well as beyond, on critical fish and fisheries questions in their territories. This allows us to bring, the best of Western science, if we want to call it that, alongside the knowledge that emanates from the places that we're working within, that is so needed as we tackle these really critical concerns for our fish and fisheries.
That's really exciting. Can you tell us about a couple projects that are going on at the center?
Yeah, sure. One that I think aligns really well with this conceptualization and has been a guiding principle throughout the work has been a project that was brought to us by the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund, which is composed of 6 First Nations in and around the Vancouver area, all Hunkaminam speaking peoples. And they brought to us this idea of adapting the Maori Cultural Health Index to their context. So the Cultural Health Index is this really incredible framework for looking at the health of freshwater systems in Aotearoa in New Zealand, that brings in not only that suite of Western science approaches to looking at what constitutes healthy waters, things like dissolved oxygen in the water or the temperature or its flow, but could actually bring in Maori knowledge, values, understandings into the framing. And so these partners wanted to do just that, but in their context. And so the first 2 students to have joined the center, Kate Mussett and Casey Sterling, they took on this project working with all of these 6 nations and various community members to create a framework that can bring together their knowledge, their values, their understandings alongside a range of techniques that we use to look at the health of fresh waters, from looking at diatoms in the water, the little algal beings that salmon rely on, to looking at all of those physical dimensions of what makes healthy waterways, whether that's the steepness of the banks or the coolness of the water. And a lot of the way that came to be was with salmon in mind, because salmon are so critically important for these nations, that we were looking at the health of the water through the lens of what salmon need, and by virtue what salmon people need. And so this is work very much in progress. We've been at it for the past 2 years, and we're starting to find our way through this work. But in addition to those ways of measuring the waterscape, we're bringing in all of these other dimensions around, if the community has access to a waterway as part of what's critical to its health, if they can use that water in the ways that they've historically done, whether that's for transport or for ceremony, whether they're meaningfully involved in its caretaking, whether they have the ability to exercise their sovereignty in that space. And so, we're excited to bring this forward, and we've been in conversation with a number of other nations wanting to do the same in their territories. And so we're building this up in a way that is a transferable kind of framework, honoring kind of the original intents for the Cultural Health Index itself.
That's really exciting. I know that the Maori seem to be moving well into the mainstream, really, I should say, that they're really a presence in New Zealand, and have a lot to offer. So, I came across your work through a paper that you published in 2020 with a whole bunch of other people. And it was in Fish and Fisheries, was the journal. And I was really struck with what an excellent description you made of two-eyed seeing. And I was thinking maybe it would be worth talking about, you in that paper you talked about 3 projects: the Slave River Delta and the Saskatchewan River Delta, and then Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And I wondered if maybe Slave River is closest to your heart right now, since you're in British Columbia, and it's the closest river of the 3 that we mentioned. But I wondered if you could talk about any of those projects and what happened.
Yeah. So the way that paper came together with Albert as the senior author in the work, we do a wonderful job of describing the teaching, because they're very much Albert's words. And so it was through conversation, him and I, that I was able to help bring it onto the page in that way. But it's really honoring all that Albert brings forward. And so in that paper, part of the necessity for that piece is kind of what you've already pointed out, that there's been more widespread application of Etuaptmuk in a variety of other disciplines, in health and in education, but its presence within the realm of so-called natural sciences, or within fisheries specifically, really, really lags. And so we were excited in this work to bring together a small number of case studies where its application has been transformative to the work itself. And so these are projects that are not my own. They are ones that we turn to draw out lessons from. And the third that you just made mention, the one that takes place on Unamagi, that is is led by colleagues in the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. And UINR, they really bring forward Etoweptimuk as a guiding principle in all the projects that they undertake. So this is one example of quite a long list of really powerful ones that have allowed them to bring forward that gift of multiple perspectives into their work. I'm really endlessly impressed by the projects that they undertake, where they're partnering really effectively with government agencies, with universities, with their own kind of partnership tenants guiding the way that they undertake the work. And it's really transformed, I think, what they've been able to do for salmon, Atlantic salmon, for eels, and a number of other species in their waters. I could go on about the different case studies that figure into that paper, but I guess what I might just turn my gaze to focus more specifically on my nation's context. And while we might not have, the practice and the name of two-eyed seeing here, it's certainly embodied in a lot of what we do in our fish and fisheries care. And that was really one of the main messages for the paper, is that we drew together these examples of frameworks for allowing epistemic pluralism from across many Indigenous cultures. Our call to action here is not that everyone take and adopt two-eyed seeing to their context, because in many contexts it's not the right teaching to be bringing into the work. In many cases it ought to be teachings that come from the place where the work is happening. And so here in Nisga'a territory, to my knowledge, we don't have a conceptualization that parallels in that same way. But if I look at our Nisga'a Fisheries and Wildlife Department and the way that over the past 3 decades, they've been running a really leading edge, amazing fisheries program centered specifically on salmon, using traditional fishing technologies like fish wheels and weirs to monitor the fish, paired with a variety of Western science techniques to understand the fish better and what's happening with them, whether that's taking small fin clips so that they can identify the genetic stock of origin of the fish that are being captured, to using different tags to monitor where these fish go and how they're faring. And fish in the Nass River, while they are certainly affected by climate change, by industrial development, by the range of threats that are endangering our waterways worldwide, we do see that they're doing well. And that that reality that they're doing reasonably well amidst this time of great change, to me, is a reflection of the good care that's gone into monitoring them. But that monitoring hasn't always looked like this. For generations upon generations, we've had traditional areas that are linked to specific chiefs and their families, organized into houses, wilps, and clans within this territory. And it's up to those individuals to look after those places. And so much has gone into really active, on the land, on the water care, that it's just really clear to me that my and our ancestors were absolutely scientists in their own right, reading the water, knowing what's best to keep these fish going, because our mutual survival is really interdependent. It's really interlinked.
Yeah, and when you think about it, I mean, the tendency of whatever we want to call sort of late capitalist fishing, the tendency to just fish out everything until there's nothing left is kind of insane. I mean, who thought of such a crazy idea? I mean, do you have any idea how they got to that place of overfishing to extinction?
Yeah, well, if you look at, some of the early documents in the Canadian context, the Canadian Constitution, and the original kind of Confederation of Canada was hand in hand with the Indian Act and the Fisheries Act here. And there's language contained within those documents that are really clear about colonial perspectives of Indigenous fisheries and how they are to be constrained and bound. And there are some pretty powerful quotes from leaders at the time talking about Indigenous fishing activities, not in a rights-based context, but as an act of grace, that the colonial government is allowing this to take place. And we really see that kind of paternalism carry to this day. But a lot of those earliest colonizers and settlers described seeing the waters here as just an endless sea of creatures with no end in sight. And I think that really led to this idea that it's inexhaustible and that we can take and take and take without there being really real repercussions for those actions. And I think underlying all of that is that assumption of terra nullius. If they're arriving thinking that there aren't people here, there aren't active caretakers who have led to that reality of there being such an abundance, they're getting here thinking that that is just the default state, when really we know that our forests have been managed through fire, our clams have been managed through gardening. We have taken care of these spaces in really real ways that have led to those previous states of abundance that have been obliterated across a lot of the province of British Columbia and beyond. But I think fisheries around the world really show, when we look at like large scale industrial fisheries, so many are managed based on looking at just a single species, not thinking about the broader scale impacts that taking as much as we possibly can is going to, have these cascading impacts. I think more and more we're seeing these calls to shift towards ecosystem-based management, multi-species management. But we were already there once, and we've shifted so far from that in these waters. And I think that really leads to this place where we identify what we call maximum sustainable yield, identify the tipping point that if we go beyond that, we're going to endanger these fish. And so we manage up to that very precarious level. That to me does not reflect a precautionary approach to looking after our fish. And it flies in the face of a lot of the ethics that I hear from my elders and knowledge keepers in my territory and in neighboring territories, that we don't take more than we need, and we keep what we catch, and we respect these fish for the beings that they are.
Yeah, and in your paper, you wrote Mi'kmaq eel fisheries were found to be underpinned by the values of kinship, relationality, generosity, and Middle-Limk, whereas the governmental approach to eel fisheries was found to be governed by a Western scientific worldview that instead prioritizes process, compartmentalization, economic benefits, and conservation. And I thought that was a beautiful sentence, to compare and contrast the different worldviews. and I'd heard also, I wondered if I'd heard that the Mi'kmaq were sort of reinvigorating oyster fishery in Nova Scotia, with their indigenous wisdom about oysters. And I wondered, I know this is sort of a field, but I wondered if you'd heard about that.
I've heard about it broadly, but I don't know a lot of the specifics. I know that there is a lot of activity happening across Mi'kma'ki to bring back sovereignty over fisheries, and we're seeing that play out in a variety of ways in relation to the American lobster fishery. But when it comes to oysters, I know that that's been a fairly widespread interest, but I can't really speak to the specifics, and would strongly encourage you to get in touch with some folks on that coast to learn more. And I mentioned UINR, who are kind of showcased within the paper. Dr. Shelley Denny is one of the leading biologists there, and a wonderful person to connect with.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. And here in Maine, of course, there was the devastation of the Atlantic salmon by the dams that were put up on the Penobscot River to mostly for paper mills. And there has been some turnaround. Some of the dams have been taken down, and opportunities have been created for the fish to get around the dams. And I think we've gone from 25 Atlantic salmon to over 1,000 the last time I read about it. But I guess it's just another example of thinking about fishing as business, or business as more important than fishing. To construct all these dams, and it's taken a lot of effort to get them unconstructed. I'm sure you probably know of other examples of that from your territory.
Across the coast on this west coast of the continent, or east coast of the Pacific, it's pretty widespread how much, if you look at the Columbia River, the amount of dams that really block the movement of salmon upstream. Similarly, there's active conversations and actions now that are centered on either dam removal or adaptation to include thoughts around passage, which hadn't really been enabled for many of them previously. And so it's great to see those shifts starting to happen. And there's good evidence to show that dam removal is a really promising avenue, that rivers can really in many ways bounce back, and it can be a means to restore the earlier state of a waterway. It's never going to look the same, but rivers are, they're innately shifting beings. You can never step in the same river twice, as I'm often told. And I think that's wonderful that we're starting to see those changes, but we really need to be cognizant of the cost of some of these ways of sourcing our energy or our water. We often talk in Canada about hydropower as a green energy, but hydropower in so many circumstances here has come at the cost of flooding vast tracts of Indigenous lands and waters. And I know many communities who've been directly devastated or cut off from their fishery at the hands of this, with specific examples of people getting notices left on their door that in a month or two's time this whole area is going to be flooded. And in the 60s in BC, that led to certain community members getting paid something like $10 to $15 per head in the household to move them somewhere else. So like it's hard to conceive that was a reality, and often still is a reality, that people get displaced without any thought.
Yeah, I read some about Hydro-Quebec doing things like that in times past. And it seemed like their assumption was no one was watching, so they could do anything they wished.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And again, that no one is there, or few people are there, or
right,
only certain kinds of people are there.
yeah, yeah. So, can do you can you give us an example of a um, conventional fisheries management strategy that was not working, um, besides overfishing, and how an indigenous approach was able to turn things around?
Mhm. I wish that there were more examples of that. I think that there are certainly lots of examples where Indigenous understandings have kind of flipped Western scientific understandings on their head in a variety of fishing contexts, or already established things that Western science then comes and, so-called discovers. And there are great examples of that surrounding kind of the levels by which we define biodiversity. There's because we exist on localized scales often, not always. Obviously, we're talking about a range of Indigenous peoples, contexts, cultures. It's not a monolith, but often because we're talking about place-based understandings, it so often is the case that Indigenous conceptualizations of the kind of unit of biodiversity that they're concerned about is more specific than that of Western science, that instead of thinking about beings on, say, a species level, or even on a population level, and in biology, we think of many populations making up a species. Within our contexts, we see many groups that are concerned with plants and animals on a subpopulation level. And I think that really is transformative to what we're concerned about and the decisions that we make. Because if we zoom out on that scale of how is the species doing as a whole, sometimes that can be informative, but sometimes that misses really important variations that exist within a group. Often subpopulations or ecotypes can emerge that are responding to different things in the environment. And so they require kind of different considerations in their treatment. And I think that really, we see that kind of again and again when we look at fishing as business, when we look at fishing as solely a source of economic opportunity rather than fishing as certainly economics, but also social, cultural, ecological well-being. We see approaches that emerge that really paint with a very wide brush, where we apply approaches that really neglect place-based understandings, and we have coast-wide management approaches that don't allow us to be context specific. And so I think there we find a real power in Indigenous forms of fishing and governance and management. And a great example here on the West Coast is around our traditional fishing technologies, where through colonization and through the Fisheries Act, that very specifically constrained Indigenous fishing to enable large-scale, non-Indigenous commercial fishing opportunity in marine waters. And the original Fisheries Act was very specific about having no freshwater fishing by net, effectively saying no Indigenous fishing in many of our waters. And that shift led to a circumstance where so much fishing activity was happening out on the ocean, where all of the salmon are, all the different kinds of ecotypes, populations, species, they're all intermixed. They're all co-migrating together in those waters. But when we look at Indigenous fishing approaches, which have principally occurred upstream, when the salmon all peel off into their natal rivers and streams and watersheds, they're finding their way home, and we're getting less of that intermingling, but everybody's kind of splitting apart. And so then we can tailor our fishing activities to focus on species or populations or subpopulations that are doing really well, and leaving those that need better care. We can leave them alone. But also the management or the fishing approaches, the gears themselves are inherently really selective. They allow us to make choices as we fish. We can make the choice to release all the females, to enable more females to get to spawning grounds and carry the population forward. And recent science has shown that, ancient middens are overrepresented by male salmon. And that's not a shocking revelation. That is still in practice today, that we're going to harvest the males more often than the females, because it's a smart ecological choice to be making. And so I find that the deeper we dig in terms of every fishing decision, it really is guided by those broader ethics of how we take only what we need, and how we think about not just our generation now, but those past and those future that are so tightly bound up in what happens with these fish.
Yeah, and I may be misunderstanding this, but I recently heard something about that some indigenous people have come to an understanding of how to relate to invasive species in their habitat in a beneficial way. And am I understanding that correctly? Is that something, or did I get it wrong?
No, I think that there's growing conversation about, when we think about invasives, and if we even just stop and think about that word, that really feels in many ways like a value judgment of what we think of those plants or animals. I think what I hear happening in a lot of different First Nations and tribal community contexts is an emphasis on thinking about what has led to that circumstance. Like what are the root causes that have enabled species to move in these new and kind of unprecedented ways? And instead of placing the blame on those plants and animals themselves, we need to look at the mechanisms that led to that and address our attentions there. And that's not always possible, for sure. But I think it's just an invitation to think about our relationships with these organisms in a different way. And just yesterday, I was in a workshop that members of my team were leading, centered on sea lamprey in the Great Lakes, which are a major invasive species. And in that workshop, it was raised as a point of discussion around, like, maybe there are ways of kind of collaborating with these invaders. Many people in this context are really concerned about their numbers, to be sure, because as sea lamprey spread, the risk to native populations grows and grows. And so clearly everybody wants to be doing something about that. But the reality is that so many of the approaches to their control have been at the hands of decision makers who do not consult, or better yet, get consent from the nations and tribes whose lands and waters this is taking place on. And so that can include putting in barriers on waterways, which has impacts to all kinds of beings in those waters, to applying chemicals that affect both the invasive lamprey, but also the native endangered lamprey, and perhaps other species in the water as well. And so there's just, it's wrapped up in quite a lot of complexity and nuance. But in that workshop, it was raised how we might collaborate with sea lamprey, that they, it's known that they tend to concentrate some heavy metals and contaminants in the water in their bodies. And so as they move through these systems, and they're parasitic creatures, they're feeding on other fish, and they're concentrating these things that we don't want in the water in their bodies. Maybe we can work with them by removing them from the system, thereby removing these harmful kind of entities, contaminants from the water, by kind of using the existence of these fish to our collective advantage. But
Well,
I think it's a
go ahead.
challenging topic, and I would not say that all nations feel the same about any of this. It's going to depend on the context of what invasive and what's our relationship with that plant or animal, and that's true of non-Indigenous people as well. And we see that reflected in the language choices that we make around those beings, where Pacific salmon that are put into the Great Lakes, instead of being called introduced or invasive, they're often just termed stocked, which sounds a lot less frightening to people hearing those words, right? A stocked fish versus an invasive one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and you make me think about sort of the conventional mainstream approach to a problem is to kill something. You know, let's poison the invading sea lampreys, or kill them. And it's interesting because the indigenous approach is, so how do we relate to these creatures? Like, how can we form a relationship that's even potentially mutually beneficial? And and so, is there another way to deal with them besides just poisoning them or killing them? Am I getting it right? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
absolutely. And for those that want to dig deeper into these conversations, there's a growing amount of discussion on this in the published literature. And Dr. Nicholas Rio at Dartmouth has done some wonderful work from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. Nick's work interrogates just these questions in a few specific community partnered contexts. And so I'd invite folks to go take a look at that.
Yeah, and there's also a really, I thought, interesting paper you wrote with a bunch of other people. Emerging threats and persistent conservation challenges for freshwater biodiversity, which was Biological Reviews in 2019. And as someone who's naive to this field, it was very educational for me. And I think the really frightening thing was the figure 1 in the paper shows the incredible drop in diversity of freshwater species over time. And wow, that I found that threatening. I mean, scary.
Yeah,
But
well, fresh waters have been so overlooked, and it they don't get near enough attention. And when we think about aquatic conservation, we get a lot of interest and attraction towards our oceans, which is great. But we also have fresh waters across this continent and around the world that are deeply endangered without much notice.
yeah, and I remember a friend of my wife's was working on a research project on Lake Winnipeg, and looking at each sort of layer of the lake and what was happening at the various levels of the lake. And it's sort of beyond my lake knowledge to know all the ins and outs of that. But sadly, Stephen Harper just completely shut it down. It had been going for, I think, 20 years, to gain this better understanding of what's happening in lakes like Lake Winnipeg. And the whole thing just disappeared, which was really sad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we see that with the experimental lakes area that was one of the world's longest standing study areas for limnology, the study of these kinds of waters. And yeah, gutted pretty well overnight, and then now relying on other sources of funding, but it was completely shut down for a time. To my knowledge, it's now operational again, but with support sourced elsewhere, and I think in a really different kind of way than prior to that government.
Mm. Well, it's good to hear that it's making a comeback.
Yeah, I think due to a lot of efforts on the part of certain researchers who've really wanted to see it continue. I mean, it's because of the experimental lakes area that we know a lot about what nutrient loading into lakes does to them. And that has huge policy implications for how agricultural lands operate in and around our waters.
Right, right. Well, and it's sort of interest. My wife's nephew is also at UBC, and he works in water, and he just published a paper on something that interests you, which is the distribution of engineered nanomaterials in I think rivers and lakes, in British Columbia. And it wasn't even anything that I'd ever thought of before reading his paper and reading your paper. And what what do we need? What do I need to worry about? What else do I need to worry about besides, or maybe in addition to nanomaterials? I know there's and maybe you've read about this. There's a crisis going on in France on its ocean coast with micro styrofoam material that I guess that would be microplastic pollution, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think that the reality is that there's many things that we can be concerned about in our waters, and what we need to do collectively is recognize that all water is connected, and that what we do in one place has repercussions elsewhere. And that makes water a really challenging study area, because it's fluid and it's dynamic and it's often out of sight. We only see its surface. And that means that there's a lot that can be at play that we don't necessarily know about. And so I think widely we need to recognize that we ought to be respecting our waters deeply because of that. And we need to, in the same way that we've already been discussing, think about our responsibility to our for our actions, and thinking about what role we have to play in its care. I've been reading Dr. Mehl-Madrona's book, Pollution is Colonialism, which is a deep dive into the world of plastics, and even just the idea behind pollution, and identifying kind of like health thresholds. I'm really marked by Max's work in this space, that so much of the Western science approach to characterizing health is to identify some threshold, that if we exceed that threshold, then we're in a scary place generally for people, is the lens that we carry there. But that kind of has this baseline assumption within it that it's okay then to pollute up to that level, and that it's okay that we have these large scale impacts. And I think it's kind of akin to that precarious maximum sustainable yield I was talking about before. Yeah, I think Max's work in this space is really insightful for thinking about our relationship to plastics. And they're very careful to always talk about plastics in the plural form, because not all plastics are the same in terms of their repercussions or even why they're used. And that book brings forward a lot of important nuance of, plastic use and generation for medical purposes.
Yeah, and
I think we can think about that in a really different light than we might think of it as straws in someone's Coca-Cola or whatever it might be. That's a really different use of plastic and a really different kind of implication. When we say we need to ban plastics, that's not a unilateral solution to all problems.
well, and I think with COVID, it's gotten incredibly worse. At least I observed that in the hospital. That everything comes to us in a plastic bag.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't know when that'll stop. But yeah, so we're getting close to the end, and I wanted to thank you for coming onto the podcast. And it seems like really important stuff, and I imagine it's as hard in the fisheries world as it is in medicine to change the status quo. And do anything else you want to leave us with in terms of websites or resources or further um, things people can read or look at?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on, and I really enjoyed our conversation today. I think just thinking about your last question about concerns, I think what we all need to do is spend time on the land, spend time on the water, be connected to it and know it and care about it. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of positive things for these waters and their inhabitants. In the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, we spend a lot of time focused on youth-centered efforts. And so I just wanted to share briefly that I really think that the more we can engage young minds in work of this nature, the more transformative I think it can be in terms of bringing in new ideas, new ways of understanding and being on the water. And that's really like the future that I want to work towards. I lead youth camps in my territory focused on fish and fish science. And so we spend time on the water, finding ulican, finding salmon, going and seeing how they're prepared, learning from elders and knowledge keepers here, eating these fish and engaging with them in all ways that we can, creating art about them. And I think that to me is a real embodiment of the two-eyed seeing Etowaptimuk teaching of how we bring together ways of knowing and coming to understand our fish and associated fisheries. So I just wanted to share that because that's something I'm deeply committed to. But thank you, Louis, for hosting me, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thank you.